Is it ever okay to reject someone's self-identification? My first instinct is to think of all the harms caused to trans people every day all over the world by constantly having their identities discredited and invalidated, and then we bring up something like Rachel Dolezal and all of the other people like her who claim to be transracial. And so today I wanted to talk a little bit about the first person authority view, or FPA, and the negotiative theory of identity and possible critiques and objections to both. Yeah. So among liberal philosophies, the FPA is the dominant philosophical view on identity, and it essentially states that I am whatever I say I am, and people owe it to me to respect me, that I am right about what I believe that I am. However, Berke Öztürk is a published philosopher and has since written an essay critiquing the FPA in which they coined the negotiative theory of identity, as they call it, and they argue that it is sometimes morally permissible to reject other self-identifications, but only under specific circumstances, which we will get into. The first constraint that Öztürk talks about is the harm constraint, which essentially claims that the act of rejection cannot cause an unjustifiable amount of harm. This is an interesting argument since harm is so abstract and subjective, not only what constitutes something as harmful, but also what is considered justifiably harmful. They also talk about how someone with a stable mental state and strong sense of self should not be seriously harmed by someone else choosing to reject their identity or questioning their identity. But they also acknowledge that trans individuals may be particularly vulnerable to rejections of their identity because of both the frequency that their identities are rejected, but also by the larger framework of transphobia within society. The second constraint is the privacy constraint, which he essentially breaks down into two different parts, and it's broken down into two different types of privacy called prohibitive and consensual privacy. Prohibitive privacy is generally things that should not be shared at any point in time, especially without the person's consent, such as the state of somebody's genitalia. And then there's consensual privacy, which is something that is okay to reveal as long as the person is openly expressing consent that this be revealed, such as the fact that they are trans. Yep. The third and final constraint that Öztürk talks about in this essay is the dignity constraint, which claims that rejection should not deny the earned negotiative identity of the self-identifier. And this basically means that if a person can reasonably justify their reasons for having a given identity against all possible disputes, then this identity should be accepted by others. More specifically, two requirements must be met within the dignity constraint. The first is that the person must live their life as an X, whether that be a woman, and sincerely identify as an X. And then B, the person must also deliver adequate defense of self against all reasons made available in good faith to others for rejecting their self-identification. Towards the end of the essay, Öztürk kind of acknowledges any weaknesses in the argument that they make, and this includes the possible objection from moral complicity, which essentially argues that somebody rejecting someone else's identity can contribute to a larger framework of oppression, and Öztürk basically denies this by saying that whether or not this person rejects someone else's identity, that larger framework of harm will still exist. I think this is a kind of weak argument because frameworks don't just magically appear, like they are made up of individual people and individual interactions that culminate So to say that one interaction doesn't matter and that it's not part of a larger framework is a little bit missing the point. And then the second objection that they acknowledge is the objection from fairness, which is I somewhat agree with more that, you know, some people would argue that it's not fair that trans people always have to justify their identities and cisgender people never have to justify why they're a woman or why they're a man, and trans people almost always do. And Ostrak basically argues that this makes sense, that someone who is transgressing from social norms would have to justify their identity and that the heavier epistemic burden falls on them because they are going away from the status quo and they have to explain why they want to do that, and that if you change your identity, you should probably have a good reason for why you're doing it, because with, like I keep bringing up, Rachel Dolezal, it makes sense that we would demand Rachel Dolezal to justify her transition identity as a Black woman, whereas we would never demand this of, say, like Michelle Obama, like why she's a Black woman. So I think this is a good point, and I think it helps draw the distinction between being transgender and transracial. I think a lot of the time people that are transracial don't really have good reasonings for why they do it, and they usually benefit from it, whereas obviously transgender people transitioning often makes their lives harder and they face more discrimination and they usually don't get any benefits. So I think overall Ostrak makes a decent argument. As I said, there are some weak points, but I think overall the three constraints are pretty good overview.